Hi, this is Lauren Cheek from Lornacopia, and I've done a lot of genetic testing, as you know, and this is not a genetic video. This is just a video about stuff. But I have several cousins and distant cousins that follow me, and anybody that follows me and is related to me, and most people that know me well know that I grew up in an orphanage in Savannah, Georgia. So they'll ask me, like, what was it like? And I will tell them, well, sometime when I'm in the mood, I'll tell you about it. So I'm going to approach this with a sense of humor, because I've always had a sense of humor and a dark sense of humor. I've had a lot of dark things happen to me in my life. But I've always kept my head about me and always overcome. So most people look at me and they typify me and they'll say, oh, you look like a surfer guy, or you look aristocratic. A lot of people have said I look like somebody that won't get their hands dirty, which I'm a very hard worker, and I'll certainly get my hands dirty. And there's nothing that I wouldn't do to make money. And in my life, I've cleaned toilets and trash cans to put myself through high school and a private school. I worked on the weekends to buy clothes for myself, et cetera, et cetera. And, I work as a waiter now, and it looks glamorous when you're at the table, but the reality is it's a lot of work and a lot of grunge. But I'm not above that, at all. And I would encourage anybody that, needs to get by, that any job's better than no job, and, work your way up. But so when I describe my life to people now, and they're like, what was it like growing up in an orphanage? I'm like, well, think of it as like Harry Potter without the magic and no girls. There were very few girls around, and we had there was a mystique around Bethesda Boys, which was the boys' home or the orphanage that I grew up in. My parents weren't dead. It was a long history that I'm not going to get into of, having a lot of kids and trying to support them, and teenagers growing up and problems starting, and, it being the 70s and prescription drugs, stuff that just altered the way things should have been, and just the massive responsibility of trying to raise 12 children to adulthood, which my parents successfully did with several of their children, but the youngest of us are the ones that kind of fell through the cracks. And like I said, I'm not going to get into all that. That's a whole nother very private story, and there are a lot of things I'll gloss over that happened to me that I'm just not going to tell you, because family members, like I said, even distant cousins who are related to me, when you dig into my family, you find out all these like horrible things that I had to overcome in my life, but for the most part, I just overcame. So I always say that growing up in an orphanage was kind of like Hansel and Gretel, more so than Cinderella. Cinderella, was basically a house slave who had to work her way up by marrying a prince. Hansel and Gretel are more the story of children whose circumstances change, and they are left into the woods by their father and preyed upon by a wicked witch who lures them with candy, and I would say, without getting into detail, that typifies a large degree of what happened in my childhood. And like I said, I had to overcome and learn the politics of getting around that. And I also was very good at keeping myself an arm's reach from peril, although I endured a lot of things that would really break other people. But anyway, so when I arrived at Bethesda the first day, this is how it went down. Dad left and went to Georgia, where his family was from, to the family farm, and consulted his uncles. And then my older sister and her husband drove the 5 youngest boys and my sister down to Georgia. So I was in second grade. My 2 younger brothers were in first grade and kindergarten. We were that young. I had just, I think, turned 7. And we spent about a month in Georgia, and then we traveled around with my uncle. My uncle Herman was actually an aide to the senator of the state at the time, whose name was Sam Nunn. And Herman had done a lot of things in his lifetime that were pretty incredible, but of course nobody was going to get into raising another batch of kids. And they had tried to help out with the older siblings, but we have such a wild streak that they were like, we're giving up on these youngest ones. We're not going through that crap again. So anyway, I think that's really pretty much why it went down. So they decided to find us a place where we would get an education, where there would be farming and things like that. So we ended up at Bethesda, which was a 650-acre property with horses and cows, where we would be taught a work ethic and get an education. And, you got to realize these guys grew up in poverty, and this was a pragmatic approach, and it sounded good to everybody. So without us knowing, we drove to Savannah for a trip, and with the clothes on our back, and maybe another change of clothes that had been packed with us before we came down to Georgia. And they drove us down this long oak drive into Bethesda, and I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But we went and we played on a playground, and the adults went inside. And when they came back out, my dad was like, this is where you're going to live, and I'll come back and get you. And then he and the uncles, after a short few words, drove off. And that's where I was with the clothes on my back. Now, I love the quote from Queen Elizabeth I. She's actually kind of a personal hero of mine. It turns out that my family, back during that period of time, were very close to her. My ancestor, John Cheek, was one of the principal tutors to her brother, who was Edward the King, the son of Henry VIII, and he also educated Mary and Elizabeth. But Elizabeth said, if you drop me out in my petticoat or otherwise in my underwear anywhere in Christendom, I would turn out just fine. She had that kind of confidence, having come through the hardship. And as an adult, when I discovered that saying, I said, that is exactly what happened to me. But not to get into all that. What was it like? Well, we showed up the first day after my parents left. We went to this cottage. The older boys, my two older brothers, were separated from the three younger brothers, and we were grouped together. So me and my two younger brothers were grouped together. The first thing they did was they got us clothes out of a donation closet, which were very out of date, assigned us towels, and then anything that we got was marked with a black magic marker with our initials. And we also had a shoe room, which had a shoebox. A shoebox is just a big cubicle with squares in it. And the boys took off their shoes before we came into the cottage, which is very Asian. But that's how they did it there, and your shoebox was also initialed. So I felt like I was in prison. I mean, I really did. It was like so bizarre. I remember being a kid and thinking, I am afraid that maybe I'm adopted. And that was my biggest fear. And then I ended up in this place and I was like, I'm in hell. So long story short, it was very regimented. We got up in the morning. We had chores every day. We went to school at public schools. We came back. Every day was regimented. You had, one day where you, for instance, did Bible study, and you do that in the middle of the afternoon, and then do your study hall and then go to bed and then get up and do it again. One day was a sports day and you would have to be assigned sports. So you would go out and play that during the middle of the afternoon, and everything was very structured and regimented. A lot of work, a lot of discipline, a lot of paddling and stuff like that. In fact, they really honestly believed, if they left us alone for any length of time, it's like idle hands are the devil's workshop. That was kind of the case. It's like, how do you manage as two people, 20 kids who you're supposed to be responsible for in a cottage? You have to keep it very military. So my whole raising was extremely regimented and extremely military. But so we'd open up with the Lord's Prayer in the morning, go over, have a quick meal at a dining hall, which was just like a cafeteria, rush through that, go to school, come back from school. Then you'd have a a activity that you were assigned. And then when you were done with that activity, you went to dinner. And then you're done with that activity, then you went to bed. And then you did it all over again. So, one day, like I said, would be Bible study. One day would be work detail. Actually, we had 2 days a week. It was Wednesday and Saturday that were work detail. And you would work for an hour or two cleaning up the campus, raking the leaves, sweeping all the roads, dusting the chapel, and plus your chores that you had in the morning. So the way I absolved myself about this upbringing, because I only saw my parents, like for the first couple of years that I was there, I hardly ever saw my parents. And then I really only saw my parents about once a year during most of the time that I was there. And I was there from the age of 7 to the age of 18 when I graduated from college. But it was this, like I said, this very regimented lifestyle. And I didn't have nice clothes. I had clothes, but I was a geek, definitely. So I became very innovative. I learned how to work, and I learned how to be creative, and I learned how to put things together. You see all of those effects in my life, when I post things or people see things that I do, they're like, wow, you pull stuff together. I'm like, well, I make poverty look glamorous. Basically, I'm not rich by any means, and I never have been, but I have a good sense of style and a hard work ethic, and I know how to make something out of nothing, and I know how to live within my means. So that was essentially what it was like. Well, let me show you what the place looked like, just to give you an idea. 650 acres of this. I'm going to turn the camera around. But this was the chapel at Bethesda. Here's another picture of the chapel at Bethesda. This was an amphitheater, which they used to put on plays and things like that. When we were small children, when you did get a little bit of free time, which might be 30, 40 minutes a day, maybe an hour some days, but you would go out and play in the amphitheater. And me and my brothers used to sit in these and pretend they were spaceships. Now, this is Burroughs and Lawton and the original, 1800s building at Bethesda, but nowadays this part burned out, and that is no longer there, and it's a courtyard. But this is the gate. This is what I drove into to get to Bethesda, thinking, oh, this is so beautiful. Oh, look, there's horses. But I'm like, get to work. that was really how it went down. So anyway, long story short, so it was a very weird kind of lonely existence. All of us boys are still very close, those of us that are alive. And we all came from really, different backgrounds. Oddly enough, this is what's kind of interesting. We didn't have any black kids at the time. They started to have black children and teenagers about the last 2 years that I was there. And I think the biggest reason for that was already the white kids were fighting with each other enough. So they didn't want to open up racial tension being in the Deep South, because the Deep South, especially at that time, was extremely racist. I think it's probably evened out a lot since then, and Savannah has become a much more cosmopolitan town again, but back then it was very old school. It was stuck in the freaking Civil War mentality, we hate Yankees, and black people hated white people hated black people, which was always a tension. So I did have know people at school, and I went to school with people of all kinds of different backgrounds, but I was raised in a predominantly white environment. We had a couple of kids that were Asian. Now, the kitchen staff there, what's interesting, we had Leslie Mae and Cyrus. And when I first went there, one of my jobs was to do all the dishes and everything and work in the kitchen, which I liked because you were sweltering out in the sun, raking and digging holes and, kicking leaves and, doing all of that. So anytime you get a chance to work inside, you take it, you're just like, cause it's freaking 100 degrees, in the summer or more in Savannah, and very humid, and there's gnats and things like that. But Leslie Mae and Cyrus were the cooks there, and we had a cook named Frenchie, and Frenchie was, I want to say he's Vietnamese. But anyway, they were such an interesting influence. And then we had Minnie. Minnie was the niece of both Cyrus and Leslie Mae. And Leslie Mae and Cyrus, at the time that I went there, which was right after the bicentennial, in 1977, I would say, They were both up in their 80s or 90s, and they spoke Geechee. And if you know anything about Savannah, Geechee is like an ancient, like a dialect from Africa. And they spoke English, but they spoke Geechee, and they spoke their English with a Geechee accent. Now, Minnie was perfectly, cosmopolitan and modern and everything else. And she was a hoot. I love Minnie, and she's now an older lady. I've seen pictures of her. It's always good to see her. But Leslie Mae and Cyrus were old enough that their parents had probably been born into slavery. And the first thing that I noticed, because I went from the north to the south that quick, was I could not understand people. I could not understand the Southern dialect. It took me a couple of days to really, really, truly understand what people were saying. And then all the colloquialisms. I mean, something the boys always said was, I'm going to kick your tail. Your mama was the worst insult you could give somebody, because we were all, from broken situations, so you didn't talk about anybody's mama, especially not their mama, so jokingly, I will say your mama to my Bethesda boyfriends now, because we're all adults. And it was so funny and such a serious offense back then. But Leslie Mae would come up to me, and she tried to tell me to do something. And it's like, I had never worked like this before in my life. And I was a kid, and I had to be taught everything. And I was a quick learner, like they taught me how to rake, they taught me how to do all of these things, which I still do today. So she's trying to tell me to do something in the kitchen, and I can't understand her at all. And the only thing I understand, which she said in perfectly good, clear English, was stupid white boy. She thought she was always calling me stupid white boy. She ended up liking me, but she was just like, and that was the climate I walked into, and the boys being, all like boys, but with lots of background family problems.